Hello, everyone, and welcome to our new podcast, Timo and Julian Talk Philosophy. As you may know, I am doing work with Julian since a long time, and we are both interested in academic topics. We have now decided to do a podcast together to bring discussion about important topics around the world to you. We want to focus on academic discussion and bring insight what you may want to know about the academic standpoint on topics that are very important in recent times. In the same way, we want to talk about European identity today, as Europe, though it is a continent which works together in a lot of aspects, there are still many fragmented identities. Welcome to today's discussion. Hello, Julian.
Hello, it's great to be with you. And I think the topic that we both choose for today is very wide in a way, but we will try to highlight some of the major points, that we can basically do in a limited time podcast. When it comes to identity, I think there are a lot of misconceptions, and usually nowadays we tend to see identity as being very linear, especially when we are talking about group and national identity. We will focus more on national identity and ethnic identity, not so much on identity at a personal level.
I think to get our viewers to the point that they know what it is actually about, what is identity, Julian? I mean, what do you think is the main point of identity?
Identity is basically, we can say what identity is and what identity is usually made up of. When we are having the discussion of what identity actually is, we can usually connect more to the fact that the way in which somebody presents itself and the way in which a group chooses a certain way of presentation and certain elements that makes that group to be different from the ones that usually it is in contact with. And also, when we are talking about identity, we can have this thing in which we have the identity or the way in which we identify ourselves and the way in which other identify us. And many times let's say, in a more traditional setting, the way in which we identify ourselves is pretty much in a harmonious way with the way in which the exterior perceives us. But there are also many cases in which there is kind of a conflict between how we regard ourselves, how we present ourselves, and the way in which basically the exterior, the people and the groups that are outside, perceive our own identity. So this is usually the trickier part. And in Europe, there are a lot of groups and even whole regions in which there are all sorts of, let's say, controversies when it comes to how one identifies and how valid one's identity is.
So we should put it now first in philosophical conception. So as we have seen, identity, per definition, is a subjective state, which means there is no objective identity. It looks like a person, many of our listeners have probably heard about constructivism. And know the world is mainly constructed in our mind, which means we create our own reality because we all have our own mind. So when it goes to identity, we can see that every person has an own identity which means that it's at first something personal, something subjective, because every subject has an own identity at first. I mean, like something like a personal identity. So it's something that appears in your head because it is the way you identify yourself. And then you have shown to us that there is something like a collective identity. However, as we can see, the collective identity is subjective as well. The thing that you kind of do is you build peer groups. So we all know this from our schoolyard time. There is like the one group which is playing soccer. There is the other group that is playing tennis, and there are the other ones who are just running around enjoying the time. And all of these groups, they have their own peer groups. So we can say like we have our own identity, and of course we look for people who identify in the same way than we do. And that's the one thing. I think the in group, we can call this in group, people who have the same group identity than we do. And then you have already shown us that there are a kind of exterior perception. It means like how the outside perceives the group. And they have their not only their own identity, but they also have a different image of the identity of the other group. I think this is the very basic thing that we have to keep in mind. Like nation states do not exist by nature. They are created. There are people who created them. And you have like insignia, like flags. Maybe you have a common language or several common language on the territory that are identified as your national language. You have a certain system that you think is the most suitable system for your nation state. So all in all, you create identity. It's not that man comes on down on this earth and he already has an identity, like to say, oh, I'm Romanian, oh, I'm German, oh, I'm whatever. So at first, identity evolves over time. And of course, if identity evolves over time, you get different perceptions of your own identity and the identity of others. And of course, there is a potential of conflict because when you shape the identity, you already have an historical path. And this means that like people, when you are educated, people tell you like these are the people who are close to us. They are our friends. And there are the other people who you perceive to be a threat to you. So there is already a stereotype, a cliche, or maybe an opinion that is subjective to you about that other group. And of course, because this is subjective, and it's just that you or your group or people of your group perceive it like that. And of course, this I think creates a bias. So of course, we have to be aware when we talk about identity. It is not something naturally given. It is something a subject does. Do you agree to that?
I totally agree, and you really made a good point with bringing constructivism into our discussion, because let's say the opposite to constructivism is usually essentialism. Basically, the idea that a group, because we are talking about groups in general and about identity, is some way preset. It is something that is preset. It is something that is linear. It is something that is not subjected to change. It is something that is basically, in many ways, when it comes to essentialism, when in a broader discussion about identity, many times it is kind of correlated to the idea that identity and social behavior in general, because identity also implies a lot to the idea of social behavior and traditions and or behavioral patterns that are usually attached to a culture which is also identified with a group. It kind of brings the idea that the behaviors are somewhat biological, that they have something that is predetermined, something that cannot be changed. And unfortunately, this, let's say, way of perceiving identity and culture many times in history was used to motivate racism, to motivate various pseudo-scientific ideas, putting groups in hierarchies, creating groups that are inferior, some that are superior, because when you have something that is predetermined, that is biological, that is natural, as some would say, you basically are saying that no matter what you do with a group, you cannot change its behavior. And this is especially the worst case when we are talking about groups that were historically let's say they had disadvantages. They were basically subjected to colonialism or slavery or serfdom and so on. Basically, essentialism is always kind of, and especially in our present context, is always kind of hijacked by various, even neo-Nazi groups and like fascists in general, that kind of try to make a very rational, they try to bring a rational motivation for their, for the policies that they want to push forward and like to make them, let's say, more mainstream. This is very problematic, and usually in academia nowadays, essentialism is kind of it kind of lost favor as it doesn't have many adherents because it has in many ways kind of a problematic past attached to it.
Yes, I agree to it. Actually, to say that biological traits shape us has a huge problem, because if this was true, it would mean that man has no choice over himself. He is not free, but he's determined, and this would imply that there are like people in the world who cannot act differently because they genetically have to do so, because they have biological traits that say you have to do it like this. But I think the philosophical approach has shown since a long time that the biological idea about this is dead. Because let's take the Muslim scholar Al-Ghazali. He said that actually education is an important point. And how is education done? It is mainly done by imitation. It's like, he says, like Christians become Christians and Muslim become Muslim because, it's like you are grown up in a certain area, and of course you adapt the traditions of your parents. So this is like Al-Ghazali sees that the reason why Christians grow up as Christians and Muslims grow up as Muslims is because of their education. They are taught their
Everything is
religion.
culturally learned at one point. I mean, it's like we are going back to, the tabula rasa, where every person, when he or she is born, he is basically born like a blank canvas on which, society, through the norms that it imposes, through, various contexts, through the various groups that he or she comes in contact with, he or she will be shaped. So I totally agree. Nobody is basically born either a Christian or a Muslim. We became Christians, Muslims, or I don't know, atheists or agnostics.
Yes.
As we grow up and we come in contact with various schools of thoughts through where we are, I don't know, assimilated in various educational systems and so on. So it's the idea, that usually connects biology and identity is always um, used even when it comes to the national identity of certain countries or of certain groups. This idea that we have a common blood, German blood, Romanian blood, basically we are united by something that is not so fluid and changeable as cultures. The fact that we are a unity, even when it comes to our genes, and this was disproven time and time again, because a lot of when you take the modern nation states of Europe, and when you look at, let's say, the haplogroups, the and let's say even various phenotypes that you find across certain countries, you see that there is a huge amount of variety, to the point in which there is not a very unifying factor. And
Yes, indeed, because nation states are also very, very young compared to, let's say, our history. I mean, if you look at the history of Europe and you go back for a long time, you will see that the modern concept of nation states is rather very, very young. Nation states are kind of teenager. They exist for maybe 400, 500 years, but they're not actually older in the modern sense. So they are something that did not exist before, but the people in Europe, the humans in Europe, they existed before. So it cannot be that suddenly uh, blood is a uniting factor, because the people lived there before and they did not have this factor. So it seems that this factor that is just chosen randomly to say,
But
like,
I think that besides biology, it has nothing to do with identity. But I think this perception, because if you will go, especially in the nations of Eastern Europe and the Balkans, we all know the various issues that are correlated with, national identity, especially in the Balkans. You will always see this type of national discourse in which basically the perception of the people that their group, their ethnicity was, let's say, very linear and very unchanged across the centuries, across different historical eras and various rules that they were under, is usually the product of a certain type of national discourse. And the identity is very much shaped through discourse, through language, because in a country, when you have all of the institutions that basically promote the same discourse that is displayed on, when it comes to national parades, national days, you have the same discourse that governs, the way in which history is presented in school books and so on. It is basically ramified in a lot of aspects. You kind of get this sensation that your group basically has a unbroken succession for 2000 years. They date back to the days of the Thracians, to the Romans. It is this overarching theme of protochronism.
yes, yes. Interestingly, I want to point out something here, because to go through a philosophical standpoint, maybe we should also explain the term culture, because as you know, I struggle a lot with the term culture. I made a whole culture critique about this, and I want to go a bit about the history of that term to see where the trouble is actually, because I think, you know, the term culture, originally you have in ancient Europe, you had a distinction. There was something like natura and cultura. There was something like, at first there's nature, it's the given. That's the thing that is there, and that maybe was created by a divine. And then there is culture. It is that which man adds to nature. It's something like that which was not given by the divine, and humankind found it. And I think the problematic thing nowadays is we live in an extremely culturalized world, given this ancient definition. I mean, if you just look around, how many things today are man-made, from our laptop, computer, smartphone, to everything we use. It's like there is no more boundary actually, like between nature and culture, in the sense the ancients held it. And I think that through this, the term culture from time to time became obsolete. I mean, it's my personal opinion, what I criticize. And the reason for this is because the problem is that culture, in the way it developed, also means thinking in a box. It's like when we talk about culture, we often have certain mainly stereotypes. It's like, I make an example. When you talk about German culture, then it means that you expect something that's typical of German. But the problem is that already in modern times, people became very individualistic, and in postmodern times, there is no more like a collective. I mean, people are so diverse today. They can freely choose their religion. They can freely choose their sexual orientation. They can actually live it, something which was not possible in the past. People they can dress like they want. There are no more restrictions from society. I mean, they are in such an individualistic space. So when you think like that it is typical of German to eat sauerkraut, then of course you have something in your mind, like a cultural image, but you actually missed something, and that it's today reality. Like, we are not sitting in every day at the lunch and drink beer and eat sauerkraut. But people have this image because they think that's German culture. And I think that's a huge problem, that culture, in the sense that it is perceived today, is more a stereotypization, which empties the word culture because it does not depict a reality anymore. But of course, culture can also have other meanings. And that's the interesting thing, because sometimes we say that culture is also something typical of the people there. And I think here again, we have a problem, because in the past, you had something like only one TV channel, one radio channel, so people were very homogeneous also in their thinking. But today, people have the possibility to choose the TV shows they show, because they are not bound anymore to one TV channel. They have the possibility to watch stuff online. They have the possibility to hear more than mainstream music. So we are so diverse today. It's difficult to say that something like, this is German, this is Romanian, this is type of culture. And I think for this reason, it's one of the reasons why we actually should get over the term of culture in the broad sense, though I don't think that we have to abolish the term completely. Because, for example, in the Chinese understanding, culture makes totally sense, because they have a completely different word that has a completely different idea of how we translate culture. It's the term wenhua, and it is something like, it means not like we understand it from our history, that it is that which man added to nature, but they understand it as it includes the word wen, which means written and literature. It includes the whole tradition of literature, of arts, of everything that certain people identifying, that they make identifying, is part of this. So it is more than just the differentiation between nature and culture. To them, when you hear their term, then it is more like you have something which you identify because of your historical path. It is included, and for this reason, your whole history and everything that makes you to what you are, what you do, everything like this becomes like your culture. And And I think it has another connotation than the Western word for culture. So of course we can talk about culture, but at least we have to redefine it. So when we talk about culture now, how would you define culture?
In because I have more of a background in anthropology, culture usually is split into two main parts. You have material culture and immaterial culture. Usually, immaterial culture is everything that is related to language, behaviors, tabiats, folklore, and material culture. Very, in a very evident sense, is everything that is architecture, technology, transportation, art, in a very broad sense, everything that is related to craftsmanship. You said a very interesting thing that nowadays, maybe it's to a certain degree a type of paradox, the fact that we are living in a world that we perceive to be very cosmopolitan, very diverse, but in the same time, we also have the perception that the world, and especially the Western world, from a cultural point of view, kind of became flatter, more homogeneous. As usually, I talked with many people, and everybody had this perception that when we are talking about the past, and not even like the very distant past, we can talk about, I don't know, what how the world looked before World War II, something like that. And everybody has this perception that, especially talking from an Eastern European point of view, that somewhat like the world, our society was a little bit more, let's say, more homogeneous, and now it became more it became basically the opposite. But if you look at many of the nations of Eastern Europe and the Balkans, that is actually the total opposite, because in the past, and especially if you take the 19th century, even the beginning of the 20th century, actually the region was extremely diverse culturally, and it was basically, it had a very complex system in which you had regional, let's say, very small cultural units as a village, which was assimilated by regional identities and pan-regional, and after the creation of nation states, they became like national culture. This became to emerge. And also within many ethnic groups, you had a lot of branches with clans, tribes, various groups that were very different even within a certain group. So there was a huge amount of diversity within the groups that were present. When going back to culture, when national cultures were created, when the national states were basically, this coincided with the emergence of like national state, what became of culture and national culture especially was the fact that you had to standardize a lot of things. You could not basically put everything, every cultural identity that was present within a country, and you'd say, oh, this is our country. You had to make a type of selection, and to make usually the national cultures are very exclusionary.
So it actually means that nation states, if I understand you right, nation states are against the traditional nature of Europe and its diverse identities.
Yeah, national states usually kind of have this thing in which all of the identities of the other groups that live within that country being other groups being like ethnic minorities, or let's say even cultural minority like subcultures, as some would say it. They are basically the national discourse that the predominant groups create kind of tries to identify and to set the identity of the minorities too. Basically, I want to give a very clear example. In many cases in the Balkans, the Balkans was dominated by the Ottoman Empire. And after the Ottoman Empire broke, and national states like Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Albania, especially in the countries, and even Romania, my home country, the states that were predominantly like Christian Orthodox, they had a Christian majority. They made a national discourse in which like the Ottomans and everything that was Muslim or Turkish was something that was alien, foreign. It was something that brought oppression, poverty, and war. And if you look in a very balanced way at what Ottoman rule was, it wasn't the case as things are painted in this national discourse. So basically, the identity of minorities are basically policed by a majority, and usually they are validated. This is more desirable, this is less desirable, or I like this group more or this group less. And basically, you don't have so much this perception of other groups through their own perception of their culture, but more you perceive other groups, and especially the minority, through the lenses of the dominant discourse, which is very selective. It's not something that usually takes into account the majority of details that are relevant. They usually kind of reduce other identities to stereotypes, or to like strawmans in which there's not much substance left.
So interestingly, I want to put in another philosophical concept, because it's very interesting to what you said. Maybe our hearers had heard of Francis Bacon, a Renaissance philosopher from Great Britain. And he actually proposed 4 idols. And when he says idol, it is the Latin idola. It's not like we perceive it today. It's not an idol, something positive, a person you look up to, but to him, the idol, it is prejudice. So he says mankind is troubled by 4 prejudices. The first one he identified as the prejudice that is common to mankind, which means we are human beings and we are limited as human beings because we are not ultimate or absolute. So the first prejudice he says is being a human being is already a limitation. The second, what he says, is our education. The second idol says that, or that he identifies a second idol, that people are shaped by their education. He actually calls it the idol of the cave, because it's like the people who are educated in their cave, in their family. So that's another thing that shapes the particular human beings. So at first, human beings limited because of being human. The second is a human being is limited because of the way that he was educated. It shapes him. The third idol is the idol of the market. And what do you do at the market? You talk, you do gossip. So the third one is language. When we talk about language, we already falsify things, because the way we pronounce them, we already change the thing itself. I mean, everybody knows this. If you talk of a cow, you're not talking really of the thing, the cow, the animal, the cow. You already say a word, so the cow disappeared. It's just in your mouth. It's just the way you pronounce it. So already in the way that you say something, you can create prejudices. And the fourth one, he identifies as the idol through dogma. So it's the dogmatic thinking. And when he says about dogmatic thinking, it's not like a religion or something or a belief. It's rather the thing that you think that your belief or the belief that you created is the only right one, and it shapes you too by in the way that you say that you. So it's like uh, you have found you have a certain belief, and within this belief everything is true because the way you were educated tells you that it's true. The way you speak or speak about something reaffirms this, and because you are human and you are limited, you cannot get over all this. So I think this concept that Bacon created in Renaissance shows very well today's society, and I think it's something really, there's something true behind it. So I think we can also include this in the talk of identity. At first, because it is something constructed, it is something subjective, we shape it through the discourse. So the language shapes it. We might shape an identity through the dogma by creating historical legends, by creating an account of how great or how good or what a nation achieved. So a belief is also part of identity, probably. And then, of course, you find a model of education within the identity because you probably, because the way you are educated, you will also continue to educate your children this way. So you have already your view about it. So you probably teach your children who is good and bad without that you have an objective criteria that they are really good and bad. And the top of all this is that it's kind of difficult to break out of all this.
You said very well, especially with discourse and how language shapes our perception about culture in general. I think when it comes to discourse, there is like another element that overlaps is the element of power, because always when you have power, and power especially when it comes to political and economical power, you will always, the groups that are economically and politically privileged will always have this ability to create cultural standards, to impose their own perception about what is good, what is bad, what is high culture, what is low culture, what is something that you should basically try for, and something that you should basically not want. This is especially the case with, as I said, identities, because usually every group that you will find will never have like this perception that their culture, their cultural behavior, everything that relates to their identity is negative in a way or invalid, because you cannot have like a identity that you presumably think that it is invalid in some way. You always, when it comes to your identity, you always start from the point that it is valid. And this can vary in degree on how you rationalize its validity. But when it comes to power and culture, you will always see this idea that powerful groups basically kind of shape the cultural landscape of a nation, and usually through their own preferences, through their own tastes, they basically create categories in which certain things I should be desired, and certain things I you should stay away from. And this usually creates this thing in which groups that are more that are poor and they don't have too much economic and political culture, they become very segregated. They basically are put in a corner, and they usually put certain standards that can never be achieved by certain groups, so that there will always be a type of imbalance in which a powerful group will police and will basically kind of say some things are valid and some things are invalid, and other groups will always be put aside. This is especially, you can see this especially when it comes to various forms of art or how certain countries present their culture abroad. There will always be various types of cultural movements within a country, or let's say cultural areas that will never be presented as being part of the national culture. Because when you talk about national culture, as I said, you are making a selection, and usually you present things that are usually seen as being pretty, as being desirable, as being something that you want to imitate. A very good example with the nations of the Balkans when it comes to this is you'll never see countries from the Balkans presenting chalga music as being part of their national culture, even though chalga is widely consumed by people. Is usually you'll always see parties, even with rich people, that always you will hear some chalga music or manele in the case of Romania. But if something is not presented as part of a country's national culture, that doesn't actually mean that that type of cultural manifestation is not very present or widely spread. It's more linked to the fact that a certain group that holds a lot of power, and this usually comes down to the intelligentsia, to the intellectual class of a country, usually invalidates that type of culture and will never kind of give it the opportunity of becoming something mainstream, even though it can have a very big audience and people that follow it at the end of the day.
It's very interesting. Of course, the important question at this part is whether we can break out of this. I mean, in one way, we probably can, even though we are limited as humans, as we become more and more cosmopolitan, like the way I showed it before when I said, okay, we have our European word culture, but for example, the Chinese have a completely different philosophical path of the word culture. So when we compare the two discourses, like how Europeans perceived it and how Chinese perceived it, we will see that there are things they have in common and things they have differently. And in this way, we might overcome prejudices, like things that we see okay, we always thought that it is valid, but we see that in other countries, they have another idea. And it is maybe the same valid or more valid, and we can overcome it.
This also relates a lot with the idea of decolonization when it comes to the study of cultural anthropology. And this is also something that is related a lot to colonialism and power, because the majority, the most powerful media nowadays, being from websites to podcasts to newspapers to TV channels, are usually ones from highly industrialized, wealthy nations. And because they have such a huge audience and such a huge funding, they usually spread their message all across the world, even in places in which the cultural landscape is totally different as an architecture. And I think we are becoming more and more conscious that we cannot judge other, especially continents and other regions from the world through the lens of European culture. And this is a huge thing, but because places like various countries from sub-Saharan Africa, or let's say Central Asia, they are not very economically powerful, and they don't have a voice, on the international stage. Usually what we hear of them, of countries like let's say Equatorial Guinea or the Congo, usually everything that we hear about Equatorial Guinea or the Congo comes from Western media. So we are not hearing about them through their own voices, but we are hearing about them through the voice of others that usually never even came in contact with somebody from that country. And this leaves a lot of room for a lot of misconceptions, and even like leaves the way to, prejudice and on the long run.
I totally agree to you to that. We really can see this on many, many scales, that there are a lot of misconceptions about certain countries. And of course, there is also geopolitical strategy inside it. I mean, we see it today in several ways. Also, of course, in the self-representation, you can see today, like, for example, in the United States media, you find again the narratives that you maybe know from Soviet times. I mean, like how they are presented as enemy. And in the Russian media, you find like that the that the society has to struggle against the West. And it's you have all these narratives again on the one side. And on the other side, if you look into the countries, they are more diverse, because on the one hand, you can see the positive and negative things in the US, you can see the positive and negative things in Russia. And of course, you can always just show an image and say, like, this is us. Like, you can show, for example, a wonderful street in Moscow and say this is Russia, and people will say like, oh wow, great, what a beautiful country. But you can also show a poor street and you can say this is Russia, and people will say like, oh, how underdeveloped is this, and so on. So you can always, of course, when you present yourself, you say this is us, this is what we are, then you always, of course, try to show a positive image. So on the one hand, you put in what you think is positive, and on the other hand, you have prejudices about the others.
Um, a very common thing, what you said about the image with like a street in Moscow. This came like immediately in my mind. Do you remember, especially in American movies, when they are usually having scenes that would be like in Iran, and everything that they show is like villages made up of mud huts, and
Yes, I
that
remember.
Iran has gorgeous cities, and it is very well developed. It has like skyscrapers, very good infrastructure, and somebody from the US that only like only knows Iran from the mass media and from movies would be shocked to see an image from Tehran with like its city center,
Yes,
because
indeed, indeed. That's very interesting, because some people in the US kind of have the voice that they say, to change the Iran, all you have to do is to go into the country. And I mean, there are some very some conservatives who proposed this, I think, into the last government. And there were also other conservatives who said, we are not in conformance with Iranian politics, but don't go in there. And you know why? I mean, it was evident, because the ones who say go in there, they are the ones with the mud huts kind of in their mind. But of course, there are also a lot of educated conservatives who know that there is a difference between movie and reality. And if you just at Iran, what the capabilities, you know that they are a heavily militarized country. So you are not just moving in and the country is yours. I mean, that these were the voices who learned from previous wars where the US participated, like the Iraqi war, where they saw that it's not just like you get in there and you are there and it's all yours. So you can see that there are also very diverse thoughts. And of course, that those who really dedicate their time to looking about, okay, why do we disagree with them? We disagree with them on their military program, or we do disagree on their nuclear weapons program. Then you have to assume, of course, that this country actually is a military strong country, because if they just had mud and huts, then they would not have such a program. So So you can already see it
Yeah, I think this image, of like villages with the mud huts, which is like uh, maybe small areas of Iran look like that, but there are also small areas in Romania that are extremely poor. So the idea that when you present such images, you usually correlate with this thing that this very hierarchical perception of the world in which like wealthy nations that are strong economically and politically, they have a lot of interest, kind of have this motivation. Basically, the fact that they are rich and developed kind of is a motive to invade other countries that are less developed. Basically, that they less developed countries are presented as failures, as something that even if we invade them or not, it's like the same thing. And basically creates this idea that um, everything that is underdeveloped is not worth our time usually, and it basically kind of pushes the idea that every underdeveloped country is kind of underdeveloped because either their culture doesn't prioritize work or education, which is not the case in many ways, or basically they try to avoid every other uh, aspect that create huge amount of poverties in other places, and especially everything that is also correlated with colonialism and the geography of certain countries. There are certain parts of the world, even regardless of how much the culture kind of puts an emphasis on work and ethics and so on, you don't have the necessary resources in order to develop a very strong economy. This is especially in places that have a lot of desert, a lot of unfertile land, or in countries that are extremely mountainous. You cannot have the same basis for development as a country that has fertile plains, it has rivers, it has like a seafront. So it kind of presents this whole like contrast between poor and rich as being something more as a type of personal choice of that country to be poor in the first place.
So I think because we made a really global view now, and of course we wanted to focus on Europe and European identity today, we should summarize what we learned about identity now. So at first, I think we made clear that identity is something subjective, something constructed, and the way identity is given to others of our in group is through language, through the discourse, and through language and through the discourse, we are able to shape the national identity in the way that we want to without actually having the need to present an actual reality. So this means that we might, on the one hand, we have a very diverse society today, and we don't have them just in one place. We have them everywhere in the world. Um, there are everywhere there are people today living in different conditions, and they can choose themselves in most places how they want to live. That's the one thing. On the other hand, through the historical pathway, we have a certain stereotypes, and we normally used to classify it in a cultural way by saying that is typical of their culture. And this way we continue to give on the stereotype by saying what we were taught or what we thought to see, like the depictions in movies, like the way people talk about a certain place in the media and this thing. So in this way, we have an idea about the identity of another country without having an actual idea of reality, because it is at first just subjective. On the other hand, today we have more means to get over our constructed views that are transmitted through education, because we have internet and we have the possibility to research things on our own and to check on whether the things that we learned are really the way we were taught to them. And this way, we can also find in a political spectrum different views, because there are like some people who have researched that a place is different than it was maybe thought, and there are other people who still have a certain image that is widespread in the society, as we made as example with Iran, where on the one hand the country is highly militarized, and of course had if a country is highly militarized, it also has a certain development and infrastructure, because otherwise you cannot stabilize this country without that it breaks out in chaos. And on the other hand, you also see that there are cities and places that's developed so that the image from the past or how it was traditionally transmitted is not actual anymore. So that we can say that identity can be grouped into parts: the self-identity with a self-image, in which we always use to classify things that we think are worth to show to others. And we have the identity about others, in which we usually have our common knowledge and prejudices about that certain place. So now that I think this is clear and was shown globally, and also the fragmentation of identity was shown on a global basis, so that a person from one place and from one political milieu does not have to have the same opinion than another person from the same place and political milieu, because people are have the possibility today to check facts, to research, to develop themselves independently. Now, I think the question is, of course, how did all this change or shape Europe, Julian?
Yeah, when it comes to Europe, to make my final idea, I think that nowadays we usually have like two different situations. We have the western side of the continent, which became and is kind of going forward with a more cosmopolitan, model of culture, a more internationalist in some ways, and also you have the thing that you in the West you have more nations that were colonial powers, so they had type of contact with cultures that were very different from theirs from earlier point on. And you also have the eastern side, which is, it's, let's say, as in its teenage years when it comes to developing its national identity. When puberty comes and we become very alert and we are more volcanic in our reactions. This is kind of how I see, like in very simplistic terms, the way in which Eastern Europe and the Balkans is nowadays. Everybody is a little bit more touchy about their national identity. We are very defensive. We are very insecure in many ways. But I think that as time goes on, things will kind of remediate, and we will get to a certain maturity that is highly needed.
On the other hand, we can see the fragmentation in Europe itself. We can find it First, of course, in the Balkans, where Yugoslavia split apart in many different countries. Like you have Croatia, you have Slovenia. That's the one thing. And on the other hand, you have nations that are today struggling today, like the Kosovo, which is caught in between Serbia and Albania, and you have like Bosnia and Herzegovina. Of course, I mean Montenegro is also there, but they don't have such a struggle, such as for example Bosnia and Herzegovina, where you have like three important parts or like three ethnic groups that are in tension. So on the one hand, we have seen that things are getting that identities stabilize, and on the other hand, we have seen that identities get fragmented and that new states evolve out of the Balkan, out of Yugoslavia in the Balkan. So what?
Yes, I totally agree. And I think this, what you exposed, kind of summarized our discussion. I think
Yes,
we went through a lot of points and we tried to give our opinion, which is, different from anthropological and philosophical point of view. I want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in and listening to what we had to say. And we hope to meet again with you in our future podcasts.
yes, I hope so. Thank you everyone for listening to us. And I think we gave an important input in thinking about reshaping Europe by thinking of stability on the one hand and the narrative on the other hand, because the way that Europe stabilizes or destabilizes also depends on not only on the objective hard facts, but also on how the people who live in Europe perceive these facts. And through the facts and the subjective feelings, new realities are created, and we can, on the one hand, of course, we want reality-based politics, but on the other hand, we have to ask, like, what is reality? Because we all have our own identity, and with our own identity, we also have our own subjective perception. And this is, of course, something which opposes the objectiveness of politics. So we can see here that politics can have a different impact concerning on how you perceive your identity, and also how much you question different identities. Thank you very much.